Right, Joshua 11, let's call this one inheritance, because after chapter 10, in which he took up for the Gibeonites to the tune of defeating 5 kings who had attacked Gibeah, he is now going to have that good news spread, but it's not going to bring him good times. It's actually going to make his enemies even more upset, and it's going to assemble an entire horde against him. But once again, God is going to encourage him by saying, don't be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow, he is going to deliver that horde over into his hand. And so the results of God giving him that victory in battle is Joshua is now going to be able to allot the territory of this horde for the people of Israel as their inheritance, thus the title of this chapter. And understand the pattern that we can see in the word, where the inhabitants of the land had their land taken from them and given over as an inheritance to the people of Israel, who by the end of this chapter, we're going to see, are going to give the land rest from war. But by the time we see Jesus in his ministry, he is going to promise the children of Israel that the kingdom is going to be taken away from some of them and given over to a people who are going to produce its fruit. And likewise, Paul is going to warn those people, New Testament believers, that you should not be proud in hearing that branches were broken off of the natural tree so that we as believers could be engrafted in, because in much the same way that the natural branches were broken off, he can break us off as well and replace us with branches that will produce the fruits that God expects of his people. And so understand how the progression goes from inhabitants of the land who had misused the land and produced much drama there, having it taken away from them and given over to Israel, who for a time used the land well and gave it rest from war. But by the time Jesus comes around, he takes it from them to give it to people who will produce its fruits. And Paul says that we should not be proud about the fact that we have been given something that once belonged to someone else, but understand that he's just as willing to break us off if we are not producing the kinds of fruits that God expects. Fruits that Paul describes in Galatians 5:22 as love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. It's easy for me to read that and be like, oh yeah, I do that, without realizing that God may have a very different perspective on what I'm actually producing. Understanding that it's so easy to tell myself I'm doing much better than I am, failing to realize that my perspective on me may be very different from God's perspective on me. And it can be tough to hear the truth of how God actually sees me. But David prayed, Lord, search me and try me, see if there is any wicked way in me. And as difficult as that prayer may be, it's so much better than the alternative of being designated for destruction. And so in order to understand whether or not we are actually producing those fruits, it takes honest self-evaluation, which points us back to Joshua 11. Why? Because one of the red flags for a kingdom that God was going to designate for destruction was a hardening of the heart of the kings over that land. And so when those kings lost their ability to honestly evaluate whether or not they were producing the kinds of fruit that God expected of his kingdom, then they were essentially raising a red flag that they were designated for destruction. Likewise with us, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. That as opposed to having a hardening of the heart, we have hearts that are tough enough to do an honest self-evaluation so that we don't put ourselves in the position of having God actually prefer to take the inheritance he's given us and give it to a people who are more inclined to produce the peace he's actually trying to create.